So let's welcome Howell Roberts.
Thank you, Anna. And thanks everybody for coming. I know this one's super early. And Anna, thank you for not doing the Baby Shark song for my shirt. So the shirt was an intentional choice. I'm not the only one that is an elementary school teacher, but there are certainly not as many of us, it seems like, we go through the program. But one of the cool things about teaching elementary school is you can dress clashing, you can not match, you can do it, and the kids are like, that's so cool. And I love my shark shirt because the other thing about teaching elementary school is those kids can smell fear, and I need them to know that I am the biggest shark in the room. So my research was on the impact of small group collaboration on classroom engagement in fourth grade science lessons. And that fourth grade piece in the title, that's kind of important as to what I picked. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So we'll get there though. I do teach at Loy Elementary School in Great Falls, Montana, about 3 hours, give or take, north of here. And Loy's real unique in the state of Montana. The school serves exclusively the residents of Malmstrom Air Force Base. It's the only resident military base in the state, and all of our students are military dependents. So that has some real unique challenges. Not that any school is, there's no cookie cutter, one size fits all. But it does have some real unique challenges because students are constantly moving in and out. All of our students, on the average, they're only in Great Falls for anywhere from 2 to 4 years. None of my students were born in Great Falls. None of my students will graduate from Great Falls. Lots of diversity in terms of where they lived and what those school experiences are like. 3 of my kids were born overseas, at military bases overseas. 4 of my kids have lived overseas. So there's this real unique environment that creates. And when I went back to school to become a teacher, this is 100% the school that I wanted to teach at. And I wasn't there. First thing I taught at a different school, and I loved the other school as well, but this was always my goal. And about 3 years ago, there was an opening and I was able to transfer in and start teaching at Loy. And the reason I wanted to teach at Loy, the reason I was so passionate about getting there, is that I was one of those students. So I grew up a military kid. My whole life lived on a military base. I tell everybody, and it's true, I never lived off of a military base until I went to college. I never lived in a house until my wife and I bought our first house. And so I was these kids. And that doesn't solve all the challenges of teaching, but it does solve a big one. You know, like I can sympathize with them when they would come in and they're sad because their mom or dad is going to be in the field for 2 weeks, or their mom or dad is at a training in another state for a month, or they're deployed, or maybe they just found out they're going to be moving, or their friends are moving, or they just moved in. I can get that, you know, and I can get down, I can give them a fist bump, I can ask them what they need, we can share stories. And we do a lot in my room also to celebrate being a military kid, because these kids also have had this breadth of experience of living in different places and seeing different things. And so we try to celebrate that because we got to make up for the part that's really hard, because there are some really hard parts about being a military kid. Yeah, so I really wanted to be at this school. The other thing that I'm really passionate about, from day one that I became a teacher, after I went back to school and got my teaching degree, is that I always have students sitting in table groups. I don't have any single seats. I've never had rows, I've never had single seats. They're always in table groups of 4. For lots of reasons, but I like that energy. I like that vibe that it creates in the classroom. I kind of teach by feel. I want kids being able to talk to each other. I want them to be able to learn from each other. You know, there's lots of times that I'm standing in front of the room, and we all do it as teachers. You're teaching your butt off, and you're like, this is an amazing lesson. And then you look out, and there's like 3 kids, and they're just not getting it at all, right? They're that complete disconnect. But there might be somebody at their table group that understands it and can explain it in a way that makes a little more sense to them, or can create a little more relevance for them. Makes transitions easier when we go, because I teach 4th grade, I have all the subjects, right? I'm not just a science teacher, but it makes transitioning into science easier. They're already set up in their lab group. If we're in reading, they've already got shoulder partners for reading. If we're doing math, they've we've got potential math helpers. I love having people in table groups. It does have some challenges, and it can seem really chaotic, especially if it's not instituted well, practiced. You can walk in and it seems really nuts in my room sometimes, but it usually isn't. And I love, like I said before, I love that energy. I love the kids being able to work with each other, and I kind of feed off of that as a teacher. So that's has always been a real strong belief. There's a problem with it, and that is that I teach 4th grade, and they don't really know how to work well together, by and large, or certainly not how to do it effectively. Which led then to my focus question. And my focus question simply was, what are the effects of implementing a small group collaborative discussion framework on classroom engagement? This is the only slide that I will read word for word. It's a lot of words. Basically, I wanted to find out what happened when I gave them a very specific process of how to have a discussion. What did that do to my classroom engagement piece? And I wasn't worried about assessment. I'm much more concerned on engagement because I'm a high energy teacher and weird things happen in my room, but I'm also, if I can get them engaged, we're gonna learn the stuff. And I truly believe that. And so I was just measuring the engagement piece. Lots of research done in terms of how young kids develop, how learning is actually constructed, how knowledge is gained. Lots of research into the benefits of working with peers. No shortage of that. And everybody that's a teacher has sat in a million trainings in terms of, hey, here's a collaborative idea to use, or here's a tool to get your kids engaged in the classroom. We've all sat through a million of those, and everybody's got their favorites. I'm no different. But looking at all the research, what they didn't have that I could find that really answered the question that I had was, how are they more engaged, and how much more engaged were they? What's that hard number? You know, I like having people sitting in table groups. I want to be able to defend why I have people sitting in table groups. Not that anybody's ever questioned it, but I wanted to be able to have answers to back that up. And so that led to what my focus question was and my research. I did skip a slide. Oh, the treatment. I'll come back to this. Because I teach 4th grade, I certainly wasn't going to tell my students, okay, everybody, we're going to learn a small group collaborative discussion framework that we're going to use in an attempt to improve engagement. I don't know if anybody's ever taught in an elementary school classroom, but that would not go well if I told them that's what it was going to be. So I just simplified it for my 4th graders, and I said, these are the rules. And I just simply called it the rules. These are going to be our discussion rules that we follow. And if you were to go into my room at the end of the year and say, okay, we're going to follow the rules, they would all know exactly what that meant. And what I did is I pieced together different engagement techniques that I had read about or tried or used or seen to try to make one that would really, I thought, fit well with the needs of my class and with my students. And what I taught them to do is, whether it was a reading or a lesson or a lab, or they just watched a science phenomena, is they then had 2 minutes and they had to quietly write their observations, thoughts, ideas in their notebook for 2 minutes. And I was very specific with that. It was a 2-minute note-taking time, and they couldn't talk. They couldn't ask questions of their peers. They couldn't ask questions of me. They just simply had to get their thoughts on paper. And they had to write. They couldn't avoid the writing aspect of it either. And the not interrupting was very much on purpose, and the not asking questions, because I didn't want, if one student wanted to write something down, I didn't want their thoughts to be altered or tainted or changed because of what another student said. Everybody's had students in a table group that are a little quieter or a little meeker. I wanted them to have a chance to share their thoughts without being influenced by somebody else. And then they would take turns as the active speaker. And when there was the active speaking parts, nobody could interrupt either. And everybody at the table group was numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. And so I would just rotate. And so I might say, okay, number 1, you are the first active speakers. And then they would read repeat to the rest of their group everything they had written in their notes. And the other students of the group, if they didn't have that, they had to write it down as well. And then person number 2 would become the active speaker, and then 3 and 4. And it wasn't until everybody had had a chance to be the active speaker and everybody had had a chance to share notes that then they could start talking and sharing, asking questions of each other. So that was the rules. That was what we taught, practiced, scaffolded it the heck out of it at first, and then slowly took the scaffolds off so that I could just say, okay, we're gonna do a lesson, and afterwards we're gonna follow the rules in our notes. I did 4 sets of data collection. We did pre and post treatment surveys students took. There were 7 questions on what their behavior tendencies were in group work. If they had to work as a table group, was their tendency to ignore their table group members? Was their tendency to want to draw pictures? Was their tendency to want to play with a fish? Whatever it was. They did that pre and post. I also took behavior tallies. That was the easiest bit of the data collection, where I just simply marked down were they engaged, were they disengaged, just with tally marks. And those engagement and disengagement, as I was looking for specific behaviors. So engaged behaviors would be looking at the person that was speaking, writing down notes as they're talking, maybe referring to the book if they say that they took a note to see where they could find it. Disengagement behaviors would be playing with their hair, or reading in a fun book, or staring at the wall. And then I also took notes on what were those observed behaviors, not the frequency or quantity, but what were they actually doing? And then when it was all said and done, I also did some student interviews. And the student interviews seem like they might be a little bit redundant, but the other 3 data collection methods didn't ever capture what they were actually thinking. And I may have recorded that they were disengaged, they were playing with a fidget, but I also wanted to know what they were actually thinking. So the student interviews were a chance for the student to say, yeah, I was playing with my fidget, but that's because I was really thinking about what Jimmy said and trying to figure out if that worked or not. That was the only spot where I could collect their thoughts. So I wanted that in addition to the other pieces, even though it seems like it was a little redundant. All those data collection methods, we've got quantitative data in the frequency of responses in the surveys, behavior tallies, and then the qualitative data primarily was the thematic analysis between behaviors I observed and themes that were identified through interviews. Oh, and I should say they were interviews instead of written responses because I teach 4th grade, and there's a number of reluctant writers, and I wanted to make sure I got those answers, so I did those as verbal interviews. So the pre and post surveys, they were identical questions, obviously, to be able to measure how it changed. And there were 7 questions, but they were questions such as, this was one of them, during group work, how often do you want to put your head down? And they had 4 responses that they could circle. I never want to do this, or I rarely want to do this. And those would be behaviors that show that they tend to be more engaged, right? Not that they're always engaged, but they tend to be more engaged. Or I sometimes want to do this, or I often want to do this. Those are behavior tendencies that are disengaged behaviors. They're often tuning out the group work. And so I had 7 things that I asked them: head down, want to read a book, want to draw a picture, those kind of things. And so then we worked on the treatment for about 4 weeks, and then I did the post-treatment data collection. And when we look at those results, so looking at the engaged behaviors, the never want to do this or rarely want to do this, because obviously I wanted them to feel like they were being more engaged and to actually be more engaged. And I made this graph. This is all of the questions that had more than a 10% improvement in terms of frequency of engagement responses. So I won't read them all, but want to argue with table group members was like an 18% improvement that they never want to do that during collaborative work. The 2 colors up here, the green is for you never wanted to do it, and the lighter green is rarely want to do it. Both of them are obviously tendencies to be engaged, but just how they responded to it. And then the disengaged behaviors, this is the improvement. I made the graph go the other way because it was less of them. And so want to ignore table group members, it was 27% less frequency responses in terms of that they sometimes want to do this. So these behaviors all showed an improvement in engaged behaviors, and these were a decrease then in the disengaged behaviors. Broken out by question, then it becomes what does it look like as a total. And so graphing out just the engaged behaviors, I never want to do this or I rarely want to do this, and the disengaged behaviors was basically an 18% improvement in engaged behaviors, which matches the 18% decrease in disengaged behaviors. The question always becomes with any of these things, was this because of our treatment? Was it because of something else? So I did do a chi-squared test on it to determine the likelihood of was it caused by the treatment, and the chi-squared test result came back far, far lower than 0.05, which indicates that it was likely due to the impact of the rules that we implemented. And then I had my tally mark. So we had an 18% improvement in students reporting their behavior tendencies. My tally marks kind of mirrored that. Pre-treatment versus post-treatment, we had a 31% increase in engaged, me observing engaged behavior post-treatment just off of the tally marks. And then the interviews as well. I did the thematic analysis on all of their interview questions and really broke down into 4 themes. So we had answers that had to do with being more engaged. There were answers that had to do with disengagement. There were answers in terms of suggestions for how to improve the rules, because 4th graders certainly have opinions. And there were some answers that brought up learning impact, how it helped with their understanding or learning the lessons or effect on grades. And again, I didn't measure assessment, but it still came up in some of their interview responses. And what was interesting, out of all these data collection methods, so we had the 18% improvement in their self-reporting on the surveys, I had 31% improvement in tally marks, and the answers having to do with engagement, it was a 4-to-1 ratio of engagement answers to disengagement answers. I then took all those engagement responses, I did a further thematic analysis on that because there were so many of them. And the bulk of those were that they were more engaged because of active listening, having to listen to whoever was speaking, having to take notes, and being a part of that. They also talked about taking notes and teamwork and speaking skills, but most of them, the vast majority of them, were talking about listening and how much easier it was to listen. And there was a bunch of student quotes that came out of this. When I did the interviews, one of the quotes that I didn't put up here, and I don't have the exact quote in my brain at this moment, but I'm about halfway through doing the interviews. They're working independently as I'm pulling people back to the back table, and I pulled one of the girls back to the back table, and I said, "It's your turn for the interview," and she's like, "I know," and I said, "These are going to be questions about the rules," and she said, "I know," and I'm all excited, and we were just doing them in our group, and you didn't even tell us to, but we like using them, and so we were just doing it. As a teacher, it kind of fills your bucket, right? So my claims from the research, I had all the data collection methods and they all pointed to the same thing. And that is that based on the evidence and the analysis, that students were more engaged and felt more engaged using this framework when they had to collaborate with their peers. There were a couple things that I did make notes on here, but I didn't measure those, so they're not part of the research, but just as a teacher, table group conversations were far quieter. That was not a bad thing. And there were far fewer instances of students becoming upset or angry. I'm sure it's true with high schoolers. I haven't taught high school, but certainly in elementary school, those emotions are still just right beneath the surface. And one of the things that we often struggle with collaborative work is somebody getting upset because they're not listening to their ideas, or somebody said that their ideas aren't any good, and I had way less of that. Extension possibilities for further research. I just measured this one discussion framework, and it had a huge impact. But, I don't know, there might be others that were even better. because I only tested one. So could do research involving different discussion techniques. Also, I put a few things into it. There was note-taking, there was taking turns talking, there was then having to speak, or then having to write down. It might be that the biggest impact was just one particular element of that. And I never thought about that until I started doing the interviews and doing the thematic analysis. And a lot of my students were talking about the knowing the order of who had to speak and how that removed stress from them with that. So that one piece may have been actually what was the biggest impact of this. I don't know. And then of course I didn't do any, I didn't actually measure its effect on assessment. Just a couple of quick personal reflections. You know, we always want we all have the same goal. We're trying to teach our kids. I love that working on this gave them a skill they can use even outside of school and after school. And then I'm sending them on to their next teacher with already being able to have a leg up in terms of being able to work together and be able to talk nicely to each other. So I love that. And then for me personally, don't know, I might be the only one in the room, but I'm a person, and my wife will probably laugh about it, but I struggle a little bit with self-doubt and negative self-talk, and that imposter syndrome piece can be very, very real for me professionally. And this was nice to be able to say, okay, I have people sitting in table groups, and here's why. And yes, I have them working collaboratively, and here's why. And being able to have that data to back it up and being able to discuss it, that's a nice confidence to have, because sometimes I struggle with that. And that's it. So thank you guys again for coming bright and early. Thank you to the people I couldn't have done it without. Any questions? Yeah?
Now that you've used the discussion framework, would there be anything that you would change about it?
The framework itself, I've done a lot of reflection on that. The framework itself, I don't think I'm going to change it all next year. The biggest changes to it is I'm going to be implementing it pretty much on day one versus having to develop these ideas and be thinking about what its benefits are and then having to wait until mid-January to do it halfway through the year. And the benefit was enough that we'll do it day one. We'll do it in more than just science, because I can already see the benefit piece of that. The other thing that I'm going to work into it this year is, and this was originally going to be part of the study, and I realized that it was too broad, I had too many variables, is we're going to be working in scripting in thank yous and kind words, and to change the verbiage that's happening as well. Even though a lot of that came as a natural consequence of doing it, but we'll be adding, I want to be teaching that piece into it as well. Yeah?
Fellow all fourth grade teachers classes.
We are the best.
No arguments. You know, a lot of times you'll have reluctant speakers in class, and you do the 1 through 4, assigning them roles. What would you do to support your kind of reluctant talkers to get them more willing to share?
So, two things, not to get long-winded with the answer. The first is just simply assigning them numbers reduced a whole bunch of that, because they then it was their turn. And the simple nature of them not having to figure out when it's going to be their turn or when they had to talk, that reduced a whole bunch of it. The other thing is, in my class, I have a number of mantras that they hear me talk about all the time. But one of the things that I always bring up is that nobody should ever be embarrassed about being wrong, being unsure, whatnot, because not knowing or getting something wrong or being nervous, that just means you're learning something new. And my kids hear me say that all the time. Like, and we'll high five. Like, if we are doing something new in math or something new in science and they get it wrong, I will go out and instead of, I try really hard to turn it from an embarrassment, and I will high five them in the room. Woohoo, you got it wrong. You are learning something new. You got something new you get to go home with today. And celebrating that. And I tell them, because if you don't ever get anything wrong, it means you're not learning anything new. And that would be really boring. And so I try to really destigmatize a lot of things so that there's a lot less reluctance to participate.
Thanks, Kyle. I just wondered about your groups. When you're kind of setting up the groups or however that's formed, are they kind of more or less, the students more or less equal, or are they differentiated?
They're very much differentiated, and table groupings are hard, and seating charts are awful. It usually starts with, I will place who are my kids that shouldn't sit together, and I put them in opposite table groups, and then who is safe to sit with them, and I plug them in, and then everybody else gets sorted in. But I try really hard to have differentiated groups.
I'm just curious. You said that the fourth graders had a lot of opinions as to what to change.
Oh, yeah.
What were some of the things they suggested?
Their number one biggest suggestion was less writing. So, to which I told them, that's great, and wrote it down, and then after I wrote it down, because of course I had to get my data for the research, but then I would tell them that's not gonna happen. That was absolutely the biggest one. There were a couple of them that wanted it in other subjects, to not just be doing it in science. And we get stuck in our ways as teachers, and things get stuck in our brain. I was so focused on doing the project that it wasn't until about 3 weeks into it, I'm like, wait, I can use this process in reading. I'm just not collecting data on it because it's not part of the MSSE research, but I hadn't even thought about that until we were already into it. Do you know what I mean? Because you're so laser lock focused on one thing. So I did start using it in others and morph it a little bit. Those were the biggest things that came up.
This isn't really a question, but I just want to say I'm impressed that your fourth graders did this, because I have high school students, and I think of fourth grade as being so young, and I think that you really walked them through this process, and I think that was such a mature behavior for them to have that dialogue, and I think that, you know, it's great that they stepped up and accepted your challenge, basically.
So, a couple of things on that. So first is I taught sixth for 7 years before I went down a grade, and I'm a really honest teacher, and I tell my kids that all the time, and I am. Like, I'll answer questions that other teachers won't, and I try really hard to I want to foster a lot of that maturity, and I want them to be much more independent, so that's part of it. And I didn't talk about it in here. I had a little built-in advantage. So I taught sixth for 7 years. When I came to Loy, the opening was for third grade, and I taught third for 2 years. And then last year, I looped with these kids. So I had these kiddos for 2 years, which I can't pretend didn't help with stuff like this, because they already knew me, and they already knew my processes, and I already had some pretty good ideas on their strengths and weaknesses. It didn't invalidate the results of what came out and the benefits to doing it, but it certainly was advantageous in terms of instituting that sort of a thing, because I knew it better, because I had it for 2 years. And there was something else I was going to tell you, and I already forgot what it was.